Europe's artillery revival did not begin with a grand announcement in Berlin or Paris. It began, almost unnoticed, in the forests and firing ranges of the far north, where three small countries made the same decision at nearly the same moment. This is Troop Talk. Let's begin. The first shot is not dramatic, it is procedural. A tracked vehicle settles into a dug-in position on a snow-stiffened training area, exhaust condensing into a white veil. The crew stays inside the hull. A digital command arrives, a short burst of radio, a pause that feels longer in sub-zero air. Then the barrel recoils, the chassis absorbs the force, and a 155mm shell begins a 40-kilometer arc over pine and frozen wetlands. Seconds later, the gun is already moving again, tracks biting into ice, leaving only churned snow and a faint chemical smell of propellant. If this kind of reporting matters, subscribe so these stories keep getting made. In the Nordic winter, time is a weapon, so is reliability. Metal shrinks, hydraulics thicken, batteries weaken. If an artillery system can start cold, fire hard, and relocate fast, it becomes more than a machine. It becomes an assumption, a piece of doctrine made steel. For decades, that assumption in Europe had been shaped by familiar names. Germany's PZH-2000, France's Caesar, Sweden's Archer. They were expensive, highly engineered, and politically comfortable to buy. Yet in the years just before the world began talking openly about rearmament, Finland, Norway, and Estonia moved in a different direction. They bought the same South Korean Howitzer, the K9 Thunder, in contracts signed between 2017 and 2018. They did it quietly, and they did it quickly. These purchases were not impulsive. They were the result of an arithmetic that had become unavoidable. The guns these countries relied on were reaching the end of their useful life. Finland's older Soviet-era systems and towed artillery lacked the range and integration expected in NATO standard operations. Norway's upgraded M109 fleet was mechanically tired, its protection limited, its analog fire control increasingly out of place in a digitized battle space. Estonia, rebuilding an army under the shadow of geography, still depended on artillery that belonged to an earlier generation of war, guns that could fire, but could not compete in modern counter-battery duels where detection can be measured in minutes and survival in seconds. The K9 offered a direct answer to this problem. A tracked, armored, modern 155mm/52 caliber howitzer that could be delivered in large numbers, at a price European industry struggled to match, and with a production tempo that mattered as much as its range. In an era when procurement timelines often stretched beyond a political cycle, the K9's industrial rhythm was part of its firepower. The system itself is built around a simple logic. In high-intensity conflict, artillery units are hunted. Drones watch roads, counter-battery radars map trajectories, and precision munitions punish anything that lingers. The safest gun is the one that shoots, displaces, and disappears before the enemy can solve the equation. A K9 carries its crew under armor and keeps the loading process semi-automated. It fires fast enough to execute multiple rounds simultaneous impact, sending shells on different trajectories so they arrive together. In a short burst, it can deliver several rounds in under half a minute. Sustained, it can maintain roughly 6 rounds per minute, enough to suppress, neutralize, and then move. Its gun range, depending on ammunition, reaches beyond 40 kilometers with standard shells and further with rocket-assisted types. On the move, its 1,000-horsepower class engine drives a platform weighing roughly 47 tons at highway speeds that approach 60 to 70 kilometers per hour, while its suspension is designed for punishing terrain, mud, forest, rock, and snow. But these numbers only matter because of what they enable. A K9 battery can arrive, fire, and relocate with a tempo that reduces exposure. Its armored hull shields the crew from fragments and small arms fire, meaning it can operate closer to the front than wheeled systems whose survival depends on speed and distance. And it can integrate into modern command networks, receiving fire missions digitally and executing them without the slow, error-prone choreography of voice-only coordination. If the K9 has a weakness, it is also part of its identity. A tracked howitzer is heavy. It consumes fuel at a rate that punishes long movements. It demands maintenance in the field, spare parts at scale, and trained crews who can keep a complex machine alive under stress. In tight budgets and long deployments, those costs accumulate. Tracked systems also place pressure on roads and bridges, complicating movement in civilian infrastructure. Every design choice has a bill attached, and the K9 is designed for hard war, not cheap peace. That is where the Nordic story becomes more interesting, because what Finland, Norway, and Estonia were buying was not just a vehicle. They were buying an ecosystem and doing it in a way that reduced risk. If you want more episodes like this, grounded, analytical, and built on real sourcing, subscribe. Finland's entry point was particularly revealing. In February 2017, the Finnish Defence Forces signed a deal worth around €146 million to acquire 48 K9 howitzers from South Korea, including training, spare parts, and long-term support. The choice to buy surplus vehicles from South Korean stocks, refurbished, updated, and integrated, was a procurement strategy as much as a technical one. It meant faster delivery. It meant lower unit cost. It also meant that Finland could use domestic industry for integration and sustainment, making the purchase politically easier and operationally smarter. Norway followed in December 2017 with a contract for 24 K9 howitzers, known locally as K9 VIDAR, and 6 K10 ammunition resupply vehicles. The K10 matters because artillery is logistics disguised as firepower. A howitzer without ammunition is a tracked bunker. The K10, built on the same chassis, can transfer shells under armor at a rapid pace, keeping crews protected while feeding the gun line. In Norway's concept of operations, small forces, long distances, harsh climate, the ability to sustain fire without exposing resupply crews is not a convenience. It is survival. Estonia joined in June 2018 with a contract for 12 K9s worth about €46 million. For Estonia, the logic was partly tactical, partly structural. The country needed a modern artillery capability fast, but it also needed interoperability, training, ammunition standards, and communications that would align with allies. Coordinating its artillery modernization alongside Finland created a regional logic, shared lessons, shared sustainment practices, and a common platform that made joint training more efficient. In the background, there was another force shaping these decisions: European production reality. European howitzers were not inferior. The PZH-2000 remains one of the most capable tracked systems in service, with high rates of fire, strong protection, and deep integration into NATO doctrine. Caesar, a wheeled design, offers rapid road mobility and lower operating costs. Archer pairs automation with speed, but by the late 2010s, these systems were tied to long lead times and high price points. A PZH-2000 can cost several times more than a refurbished K9, depending on configuration and support. And as demand rose, queues lengthened. Even before the shock of the Ukraine war, procurement officers understood that best was sometimes less important than available. The K9 exploited that gap with industrial discipline. South Korea built the K9 for its own strategic environment, a heavily militarized peninsula where artillery mass and rapid replacement were central to deterrence. That meant large production capacity, stable supply chains, and an export model that treated speed as a feature. Where some European programs operated like bespoke engineering projects, Korea's approach resembled scalable manufacturing. This difference in philosophy became visible in the trials that Nordic armies conducted. For Finland and Norway, Arctic performance was not a marketing claim, but a filter. Cold start reliability, mobility in deep snow, and endurance in prolonged exercises were decisive. A howitzer that performs perfectly on a temperate range, but fails when temperatures drop below -20, is not a howitzer. It is a liability. By the early 2020s, these decisions began to compound. The Nordic K9 fleets were not static acquisitions, they became platforms around which doctrine, training, and logistics could evolve. The point was not just to replace old guns, but to rebuild artillery as a system. Sensor-to-shooter networks, digital fire control, and rapid resupply under protection. In a modern fight, the first side to connect sensors to guns faster usually fires first. The second side absorbs the consequences. If you're following this series, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Then came the event that turned artillery from a niche capability into a continental priority: Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The war made one fact unavoidable. In the era of drones and precision munitions, artillery did not become obsolete. It became central again. The frontlines in Ukraine proved that massed fires, sustained logistics, and rapid barrel replacement are not Cold War relics. They are the grammar of high-intensity war. European ministries reacted by searching for what could be bought quickly, delivered at scale, and sustained without waiting years for new production lines. The Nordics had already done the homework. Their early adoption functioned as a kind of market validation. They had tested the K9 in winter, integrated it into NATO frameworks, and demonstrated that it could be sustained by small militaries with demanding terrain. For larger buyers, this reduced uncertainty. The most dramatic example was Poland. In 2022, Warsaw signed a sweeping package with South Korea that included K2 tanks, Chunmoo rocket artillery, and a massive order for K9 howitzers, eventually framed in public reporting as hundreds of systems and a multi-billion-dollar rearmament effort. Poland's approach was different from the Nordics. It was not just buying weapons, it was buying time and paying to import industrial capacity. Technology transfer, local assembly, and long-term production inside Poland were part of the deal, turning procurement into industrial policy. This is where the narrative shifts from machines to systems that build machines. Because the K9's success in Europe cannot be understood only through range and rate of fire. It is also about manufacturing. Europe's defense industrial base, after decades of limited demand, has struggled to ramp up quickly. Production lines that were optimized for low-volume peacetime orders cannot easily scale to wartime tempo. Skilled labor, specialized components, and quality control are bottlenecks. Contracts can be signed faster than factories can expand. Hanwha, the Korean manufacturer behind the K9, has benefited from a different history. South Korea maintained high-volume defense production as a national priority, and it invested in export readiness. By the mid-2020s, the K9 family had been selected by a growing number of countries, and deliveries had reached into the thousands across variants and licensed productions. Turkey built its Fırtına howitzer based on the K9 design. Others fielded the K9 directly. The result was a mature supply chain, a proven platform, and a global service footprint that European buyers could join rather than create from scratch. The K9's dominance, however, is not absolute. It competes against European systems with different trade-offs. The PZH-2000, for example, offers exceptional protection and deep ammunition handling capacity, but it is heavier, around the mid-50-ton class, and more expensive to procure and sustain. Caesar, in contrast, can move fast on roads, approaching highway speeds around 100 kilometers per hour depending on variant, and is cheaper to operate, but its wheeled chassis and lighter protection shift risk onto mobility and concealment. Archer pushes automation and fast shoot-and-scoot sequences, but it is a more specialized system with procurement complexity and historically limited production scale. What the K9 offered and what the Nordics validated was a balanced center: tracked mobility for rough terrain, sufficient armor for survivability, modern digital integration, and an industrial model capable of delivering in volume. In procurement, this combination can outweigh marginal differences in maximum performance. By 2025, The Nordic fleet had expanded well beyond those initial contracts, reaching a combined total that reflected both earlier planning and the post-2022 urgency. Norway moved to increase its inventory substantially, with follow-on orders that raised its fleet toward the 50-system range, supported by additional K-10 vehicles. Estonia continued to receive new batches as part of its broader defense investment plan. Finland exercised options that brought its total far beyond the original 48, turning the K-9 into a core system rather than a one-off purchase. Recent events underline how this ecosystem is still evolving. On September 18, 2025, Norway signed a third contract for 24 additional K-9 VIDAR howitzers, a decision rooted in Arctic defense priorities and the practical experience of operating the system in demanding conditions. It signaled not only confidence in the platform, but a decision to standardize at a scale large enough to matter across brigades and training pipelines. On November 24, 2025, Estonia announced the arrival of 6 new K-9 howitzers at the port of Paldiski. For a small state, a shipment like this is not symbolic. It is measurable combat power, delivered in steel and schedules, tightening the link between procurement and readiness. On October 17, 2025, South Korea opened its ADEX defense exhibition with an explicit message. It is not merely exporting hardware, it is exporting a future model of warfare that combines artillery with automation, unmanned systems, and artificial intelligence integration. For European buyers, this matters because it suggests the K-9 platform is not frozen in its original design. It is being upgraded into a family of systems that can evolve with doctrine. On December 29, 2025, Poland signed an agreement with a Hanwha-led consortium to build a factory on Polish soil for guided rocket production tied to the Chunmoo system. This matters because it reveals the deeper logic of Poland's rearmament. Acquisition is paired with domestic manufacturing capacity, reducing vulnerability to supply disruptions and turning defense spending into industrial transformation. And on December 30, 2025, Hanwha announced another major implementation contract linked to Poland's rocket artillery, valued in the billions of dollars. Even when not directly about the K-9, these announcements reinforce the same theme. South Korea is embedding itself in Europe's defense supply chain, not as a temporary supplier, but as a structural partner. Taken together, these developments clarify why the Nordic choices of 2017 and 2018 were so consequential. Finland, Norway, and Estonia were not chasing trends. They were responding to constraints that would later define the entire continent. Limited time, limited budgets, limited industrial capacity, and a growing requirement for systems that can be fielded now, not promised later. The near-term outlook, over the next 12 to 24 months, is less about new technology than about scale and sustainment. Contracts will continue to grow, but the deeper question is whether maintenance networks, ammunition stockpiles, and trained crews can keep pace. Artillery readiness is not a static number. Barrels wear, spare parts run out. Crews rotate. Supply lines decide whether a fleet is real power or a parked inventory. Europe is also learning that interoperability is not just software. It is shared platforms, shared training, and shared logistics under pressure. The Nordic K-9 fleets, by standardizing early, created a regional foundation that larger alliances now try to replicate at greater scale. In a crisis, common systems simplify everything from ammunition interchangeability to repair procedures. They reduce friction where friction kills, yet there is an enduring trade-off. The more Europe relies on foreign production, the more it must manage dependency on supply chains, political decisions, and industrial priorities outside the continent. Poland's push for local manufacturing is one answer. Others are exploring European production expansions and joint procurement. The K-9 story is not only about Korea winning contracts. It is also about Europe confronting the costs of having let its own mass production capacity shrink. In the end, the Nordic decision to buy the same Korean howitzer was not a mystery. It was a rational convergence under pressure. Cold climates, aging fleets, limited budgets, and a need to modernize quickly. The K9 did not seduce them with novelty. It persuaded them with delivery schedules, sustainment plans, and a platform that worked when the snow deepened and the clocks ran fast. If you value documentaries like this, subscribe so this kind of work keeps reaching you. Back on the firing range, the gun settles again. The crew runs through the drill with practiced calm. A command arrives, coordinates translate into elevation and bearing, the breech closes. The barrel recoils, and the vehicle is already preparing to move. In Northern Europe, artillery is not just about reach. It is about tempo, industry, and trust, and the loudest decisions are often the ones made quietly, years before the world starts listening. Thanks for watching.